In this video, we will discuss black fatigue. How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit, by Mary Frances Winters. Racism is making black people sick. Research links racism with chronic stress and poor health in black people. Diversity specialist Mary Frances Winters highlights the multiple forms of racism black people still endure today. Such racism helps generate an intergenerational cycle of inequality. Winters urges readers from all backgrounds to acknowledge different forms of privilege and the power structures and attitudes that perpetuate bias. Now let's see some of the main takeaways from this text. 1. Systemic racism passes trauma and stress down through the generations, causing black fatigue. 2. White people should stop denying their privilege and act as agents of social change. 3. Don't just be a non-racist, be an anti-racist. 4. An intergenerational cycle of financial inequality prevents black people from succeeding. 5. Racism leads to chronic stress among black people, which also affects their physical health. 6. Black people receive poorer medical care due to implicit biases. 7. Black fatigue increases for people who have intersecting marginalized identities. 8. Black fatigue affects men, women, and children in varying ways. 9. Communities must work together, jointly, to overcome black fatigue. Finally, let's discuss the summary of the book in greater depth. Systemic racism passes trauma and stress down through the generations, causing black fatigue. Black fatigue is a consequence of the oppression that racist systems have perpetuated against black people and their communities for generations. The collective trauma black people must live with contributes to black fatigue. Black people still experience racism on multiple levels today: interpersonal, institutional, structural, as when corporations fail to prioritize diversity and inclusion, and internalized. White people must aspire to be anti-racists and push for systemic change. White people should stop denying their privilege and act as agents of social change. During the 2020 protests supporting the social movement Black Lives Matter, many white people reacted by claiming ignorance of how everyday racism affects black people. White people sometimes experience sublime ignorance about racism because they don't feel the need to understand something that doesn't have a direct impact on them. Instead, people should recognize the advantages they have and stop denying white privilege. White people also need to become better at understanding which behaviors imply a belief in white supremacy. These behaviors don't simply include belonging to hate groups, but also encompass everyday forms of racism like allowing white voices to dominate work meetings. To understand racial power dynamics, consider what it means to be part of a dominant group versus a subordinated group. Those from social groups which have, historically, dominated others, such as white people, often view themselves and those like them as the norm, while framing those they oppress, such as black and brown people, as deviant or abnormal. Internalizing these norms can harm black people's sense of self and perpetuate racist power structures. Don't just be a non-racist, be an anti-racist. Work toward deconstructing oppressive systemic structures of power by doing the following. Support anti-racism for the right reasons, rather than supporting diversity and inclusion by making a business case for overthrowing racist systems. Support it because that's the right thing to do. 2. Don't try to sanitize other stories of marginalization. Don't shy away from language and situations that make you uncomfortable. Have those important conversations about equality in your workplace. 3. Deprioritize white comfort. Don't make the comfort of white leaders the focus of your attempts to work toward diversity and inclusion. Focus on addressing the fatigue black people experience and the need for healing during these conversations. Embrace and support allyship. Being non-racist is insufficient. Instead, become an anti-racist who actively opposes racism. Act as an agent of social change. Understand your power. You can work toward change in small ways, such as choosing ethical ways to spend your money. An intergenerational cycle of financial inequality prevents black people from succeeding. Several socioeconomic indicators suggest that progress toward racial equity is stagnating. For example, black people were significantly less likely to own homes than white people in 1976, and the same disparity exists today. On average, black people's net assets are 10 times smaller than those of white people. This economic disparity partially results from the intergenerational transfer of wealth. White supremacist systems made accruing wealth difficult for black families. White people benefited from these racist systems, and were able to pass accrued wealth on to their descendants over the course of multiple generations. Nearly 1/5 of black families today have a negative net worth or own nothing. The socioeconomic inequities that black people face, including more difficulty securing livable wages, stable jobs, retirement benefits and mortgages, contribute to an intergenerational cycle of inequality. Many leaders fail to create diverse teams, and few people of color occupy leadership roles today. Black people also face educational obstacles. Schools today are more racially segregated than they were in 1954. Black schools tend to have more lower-income students, and public schools with few white students tend to lack resources and funding. Only 10% of teachers are black, and white teachers often perpetuate racism by having lower expectations of their black students. Teachers hold harmful biases about the potential and innocence of black students, giving them harsher punishments than white students. Challenges like these during childhood hinder black children's socioeconomic progress and life outcomes. Racism leads to chronic stress among black people, which also affects their physical health. Black people have poorer health than white people in various ways. Black high school students are more than 60% more likely to attempt suicide than their white classmates. The black infant mortality rate is more than double that of white infants. Black women are more likely to die of breast cancer and cervical cancer than white women. Black people are also more likely to die of heart attacks, strokes and asthma than white people. Experiencing everyday racism contributes to elevated levels of chronic stress, which leads to conditions such as high blood pressure. Researchers at Auburn University also concluded that racism ages you. The cells of African Americans who reported more experiences of discrimination showed more rapid signs of aging. Black people experience place-based stress when acts of racism occur in spaces they must traverse in their everyday lives. For example, people working in department stores might make negative assumptions about black people, treating them as potential criminals they suspect of shoplifting, as opposed to respecting them like other paying customers. People who experience racism pass down their trauma, which an individual can process as depression, anxiety, rage, shame, insecurity, diseases and fatigue, to the next generation, which leads to the community experience of multi-generational or historical trauma. Black people receive poorer medical care due to implicit biases. Research shows that some physicians are more likely to prescribe pain medicine for white patients than for black ones. Another study showed that white people receive better health care than black people. For example, doctors tend to prescribe older medications to black people with mental health disorders. Those medications have more negative side effects. Black Americans wait longer for health care than white Americans. Moreover, black women from middle-income brackets are up to 4 times as likely to die giving birth than white women. Racial minorities also have poorer health than white people because they face environmental racism. Black and Hispanic people are more likely than white people to live in food deserts, areas that lack access to healthy food sources, such as supermarkets. To combat the multiple health-related inequities black people have endured for generations, push for solutions on a systems level, such as anti-racist healthcare policies, like trauma-informed care. Advocate for ways to alleviate the individual psychological and physiological stress that interpersonal racism creates. These approaches include improving access to healing and self-care practices, like mindfulness. Black fatigue increases when people have intersecting marginalized identities. Intersectionality refers to the fact that individuals often belong to multiple groups, based on factors such as gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, age and race, and that their overlapping identities shape their experiences. When people identify with more than one marginalized group, their experience of black fatigue can increase. For example, if you're gay and black, you may face elevated levels of discrimination, compounding your black fatigue. While nearly 70% of black people oppose policies that allow businesses to refuse of services to people with LGBTQ identities, stigma does still exist for people with non-heteronormative identities within black communities. Research shows that more than 60% of whites and nearly 60% of Hispanics support same-sex marriage, but only 51% of blacks do. Don't take a one-identity approach to addressing racism. Rather, account for the multiple identities and layers of discrimination people navigate each day. If you're heterosexual, it's important to understand the privileges your sexual identity affords you. Public affection. You can touch the person you love in public without fearing negative reactions from others. Less job insecurity. You don't worry that your relationship will cause you to lose your job. Openness with those close to you. You don't feel compelled to hide the details of your private life from family and friends who might reject them. Your work treats your partner like other people's. If your company transfers you to a new location, you don't worry that they won't support your partner's relocation. Freedom to worship where you please. If you're religious, you don't need to worry that places of worship will bar you from entering because of your gender or sexual identity. Freedom from hate crimes. You don't fear others will physically harm you because of your sexual identity or relationships. Black fatigue affects men, women, and children in varying ways. Black women, men, and children face different challenges. Black women must contend with many stereotypes, including resilience, anger, and promiscuity. Black children are more likely to suffer from childhood depression. Black men must grapple with negative media depictions of their masculinity that present them, for example, as dangerous. They also have higher rates of incarceration than other racial groups, with 1/3 of black men serving a prison sentence at some point in their lives. Additionally, black people have higher divorce rates and get married less often than white people. Black people must disrupt negative stereotypes and push for more balanced portrayals of black identities, while crafting their own positive narratives about race and gender. Communities must work together, jointly, to overcome black fatigue. To become an effective ally as a white person. 1. Take responsibility for benefiting from racist systems. Slavery created intergenerational poverty, resulting in today's wealth gap between white and black people. Institutions and companies that, historically, profited off the slave trade owe reparations to black people. 2. Adapt and interrogate systems. Don't address racism in a performative manner. Work for real change by taking action steps, like conducting cultural audits and lobbying for reforms to systems such as education and policing. Become an anti-racist, acknowledge and combat racial inequities. Leverage your power for social change. Use your position of power to demand people reform racist systems. Overcome white fragility. It's important people have conversations about race, even when they feel uncomfortable or difficult. Meanwhile, black people can take the following actions. Speak out. Share your concerns about the daily inequities you face with others. Remain vigilant. Follow the news. Lobby and vote for policies that dismantle racism. Say no sometimes. You don't have a responsibility to teach white people about their own racist history. 4. Avoid deficit narratives. Don't make statements that portray black people as deficient, rather than attributing blame to racist systems. For example, don't say, black people are exhausted. Instead, say, racism is exhausting. Use your power. Once you gain status, don't assimilate into white power hierarchies. Work to lift up others. 6. Remember self-care. Don't internalize racism. Reject oppressive white norms, and work to build a more positive self-identity. Thanks for watching. Check out our other video summaries of these books and make sure to subscribe.